I actually thought I'd seen this movie. I reviewed a very similar sounding movie called She Walks the Woods, but that is not this film. This is She Came from the Woods. This is directed by Erik Bloomquist, who co-wrote this. You've got a couple of recognisable faces here. William Sadler, who you'll know from a variety of kind of character roles, including Demon Knight. Cara Buono, I think that's how you pronounce her name, who you'll know from Mike's mum from the Stranger Things Netflix show. And this is a loving homage to the 80s kind of slasher, kind of Evil Dead kind of style movies. And it really does feel like a kind of a mix between Friday the 13th and Evil Dead in many ways. So it takes place in the late 80s in a kind of summer camp. And the camp is just wrapping up for the summer. The kids are on a kind of a bus home to their parents and such, and the camp counsellors are having this kind of end of sort of season party where they kind of do this kind of ritual where it's this, you know, this typical kind of campfire tale, this legend of this kind of curse that surrounds this particular camp. However, they unknowingly kind of resurrect this kind of vengeful spirit who seems to possess the kind of counsellors and have ill intent towards them. Now, what will happen? You will have to watch the movie and find out. So, what do we think? Okay, so these movies like this, kind of these retro kind of style 80s movies, I have to say I do quite enjoy. I've enjoyed kind of a lot of these, especially if they capture that essence of the 80s. And I think this movie does a pretty good job. You know, we've got kind of that kind of the fashion. We've got a guy, for example, who's clearly styling himself over the David character from Lost Boys. It's quite funny. But yeah, the fashions, the kind of the hair, everything like that, the music, I think is all in kind of line with the kind of the time. Even some of the kind of the way these characters speak is very 80s compared to today. Now, for example, there's a particular insult that the character sort of says and stuff, which you really wouldn't say that in this day and age, but in the 80s, it was said quite often because it was, you know, it was just an insult back then. Now it has causes greater offence. So I'm glad to see that they have kind of stuck to their guns to make a true homage to the kind of the 80s. That was actually pretty fun. And I have to say, even this way the movie is filmed, it still has a, you know, it's clearly obviously a modern film, but it still has that sort of slight sort of grain and look like it would be from an 80s film, but albeit, you know, you're not struggling to see what's kind of going on or anything like that. So that was all pretty good. The pacing is fairly good in this movie. I mean, it doesn't take too long before this kind of like the everything starts to kick off, and there's a lot of characters here. So this has a fairly kind of high body count, and it's not afraid to kind of have violence against young children. So I was kind of quite shocked, to be honest with you, at some of the kind of the violence that befalls some of these kind of younger characters. It mainly befalls the more grown-up characters, to be fair, but there is a few occasions here where kids are attacked. Admittedly, they might be possessed, but, you know, they're still kids at the end of the day. The actual kind of, I guess, antagonistic force, you might say, is less Jason Voorhees and more kind of Evil Dead, which is more in my wheelhouse, to be honest with you. But there are elements here of that kind of slasher, but there's certainly that kind of the unknown element where we have these kind of supernatural forces, curses, secrets, and things like that I think make this movie a little bit more kind of maybe unpredictable than you know, a maniac in the kind of the woods and stuff like that, because you don't quite know the extent of this thing's powers and stuff like that, which kind of gives it this more of a mysterious kind of background to a certain degree. And there is some chilling kind of imagery. This kind of, it's the spirit of this kind of nurse, basically, and she's hanging like jars of blood from the trees, and it's a great visual, looks pretty good. And, you know, on a technical level, in regards to the visuals, yeah, I thought this movie was well put together. You know, it looks kind of sharp and professional. And yeah, the presentation is good. And I think for the most part, the acting is solid as well. All the cast here do a good job in their kind of roles. But let's now pivot to what I think doesn't work. I'm going to stick with the cast, and yes, I do think the acting is fine here, but one of the problems I think this movie has is it has way too many characters. So much so that there's not really a central character. I mean, there's a central group of characters, I suppose, but not really a point of view character. So you don't really feel like you're following a main character, to be honest with you. There's not necessarily a bad thing, or it can be not necessarily a bad thing, but you know, it gives you less to kind of latch onto because you're not kind of invested so much into one character and you're not completely sure who you're meant to be kind of rooting for. I have to say, I think the mythology here is a little bit kind of muddled. I actually found this movie at times, even though the story is relatively kind of basic, it's not exactly a hard movie to follow, and if you're looking at the broad strokes, but some of the kind of the details here I found a little bit inconsistent and didn't really make too much logical sense in many ways. You know, there just seems to be sort of leaps in logic a lot of the time, and I put this down to some script issues, if we're being completely honest, and things just seem to happen and we see stuff on screen and we're not really quite sure what's actually kind of going on. So I think this movie's narrative ends up being kind of a little muddled, and you know, you factor that in with maybe you're not kind of completely kind of brought into the characters because you know, there's so many of them, for example, that, you know, it's kind of like you don't quite have that engagement that you really are looking for in a kind of a movie like this. I have to say, there is quite a lot of violence, but I do think it could have been a little bit bloodier. There is lots of, I mean, there's some violence and some gore. A lot of people end up kind of biting the bullet, so to speak, but I don't feel like this movie really kind of had a huge amount of kind of gore, considering the kind of the violent acts that were falling these people. There is some, don't get me wrong, but I think it could have lent into that a little more. So overall, I've got to say, I think this movie is a pretty good watch. I don't really think it stands up as a kind of a classic movie. I mean, if you're looking at these kind of retro sort of 80s sort of style movies, to me Turbo Kid is top of the pile. I know a lot of people like Summer of '84, but this is okay, it's pretty good. I don't think it's like a bad watch in any way. It's a little bit jumbled, a little bit muddled, and ultimately, the story-wise at least, somewhat kind of directionless in some aspects. So for me, it is just an above average movie, just about. I will give this one a 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.